In this Lords of the Fallen video, we're going to be taking a look at the 4 hidden or 4 unlockable classes of Lords of the Fallen. I'm going to be showing you their starting equipment, talking a little bit about each class, and telling you guys a little bit about how to unlock them. Full details on how to unlock them will be on the wiki, so you can check that out if you want all the details, but I'll just be kind of giving you a rough synopsis. So the first class we're going to take a look at here is the Radiant Purifier class. This class is unlocked by purifying all the beacons of the game. If you don't know what that is, you will shortly. You won't need any further explanation once you understand, but once you do that, beat the final boss of the game, you will unlock this class. And as you might expect, this is a Radiance-based class. It has extremely high Radiance, the same as the Orient Preacher, but it has a much higher starting level, meaning that its other base stats are higher. It starts with the Radiant Purifier pull arm that does physical and holy damage that scales with strength, agility, and radiance, although it's predominantly agility and radiance. And it also does smite buildup, which deals damage kind of like in a burst after you build up enough on the character. Not a huge fan of this weapon's moveset in general. It does have a nice sweep when you're doing it one-handed that can cleave through multiple enemies, but it's kind of slow, and its two-handed moveset, it's not that great in my opinion. However, it does start the game with a Radiant Purifier Catalyst, which is one of the 2 strongest spell power catalysts in the game. So you're going to be starting with an extremely strong catalyst. Agony's Light is the other one. I believe they have similar spell power casting. Agony's Light is not hard to get, so this is a bit of a boost to you early on in the game, but it's not a significant boost to you in the long term. It also begins the game with 3 spells, Piercing Light, Aura of Tenacity, and Healing Sigil. Aura of Tenacity and Healing Sigil are acquired once you reach Skyrest Bridge, so these are not particularly great, but Piercing Light isn't obtained until much, much further in the game. The issue about having this spell so early on, though, is that it costs way more mana than Radiant Flare, which is kind of like the smaller version. So it's not particularly mana efficient early on in the game, though it does pierce multiple enemies, so there is a case to have it slotted if you're going like a pure Radiance type build. It also comes with the Radiant Purifier armor, which is kind of like a lightish medium type armor that has a focus on holy damage resistance, which you may want to sub out for heavier armor, up to you, unless you like the look. And it comes with the Empyrean Pendant, which you can acquire much further into the game, probably 10 to 15 hours in, that boosts your holy damage and holy defense. This is a really good pendant if you are using like holy damage spells or you're playing a Radiant type build, so it's really nice that you can get that earlier on in the game. All in all, the biggest advantages of this class are its starting weapon, are its Piercing Light spell, which you won't get till later, and the Empyrean Pendant till you won't get till much later. So you'll get to use a few things you wouldn't get till much further in the game early on, and also you start with more attributes than most other classes, so you kind of start off to a stronger start in general. Next, we'll take a look at the Lord class. This is acquired by not cleansing the beacons, so basically doing everything else that you did for the previous class, but instead of cleansing those beacons, just not cleansing them, and then you'll get this when you complete the game. This class begins the game with the Lord Axe, which is an Inferno scaling axe and strength scaling axe, predominantly Inferno. That is a very heavy axe. It's a grand axe, so it swings very slowly and deals physical and fire damage. So if you want to play like an Inferno build, or you're planning on making like a Pyromancer for like a new playthrough, then this would be, kind of the general theme of this. And you also have the Lord Catalyst, which is one of the 2 strongest spell power Inferno catalysts in the game, and you wouldn't normally get these until way later in the game. So you're effectively going to be able to use the strongest Inferno catalyst from the very beginning, so that's a really good reason to use this as well. You also gain access to Infernal Weapon, Infernal Slash, and Adir's Endurance, Pyromancies, or Inferno spells. These are available to you from the very beginning of the game. Normally you wouldn't get these until much, much later in the game, so you're going to have access to some spells you wouldn't normally be able to gain access to through a huge portion of the game. So again, another reason that this class has a huge advantage at the beginning. It also comes with a Lord's Armor, which has pretty good protection, and it comes with the Ring of Bones and Ring of Duty. Ring of Duty you can buy in Skyrest Bridge pretty early on in the game, so that's not a huge pickup, but it does increase your vitality and endurance. And you also gain the Ring of Bones, which increases your encumbrance or your equip weight so that you can use heavier armor and still, fall into that medium category ideally. This is a very strong starting game class, in my opinion. It's probably the strongest starting class that you can get or unlock because of the things that you wouldn't normally get so far into the game. The next class we're going to take a look at is the Putrid Child. This class is unlocked by doing the Umbral ending of the game, and there are a lot of steps to do this ending related to the Umbral Scourings that you pick up throughout the game. If you want full details on how to do that, check that out on the wiki because it is just way too much to go into here. This class begins the game with very high stats in Radiance and Inferno and very low strength and agility. So if you want to play an Umbral build, this kind of stat-wise is optimized for an Umbral build from the very beginning of the game. It also begins with the Putrid Child's Sword, which does physical and wither damage when it attacks. It also has Frostbite buildup, which you'll see pop in the gameplay periodically as I build up Frostbite on enemies. That triggers like a damage burst on them. It scales with Radiance and Inferno, so as you increase Radiance and Inferno, your melee damage is also going to increase. Wither is not that great of a damage type, though, in my opinion, because it puts that gray health on the enemy or white health on the enemy that, like, what happens to you. You have to hit them again before they hit you in order to pull that health off. Works well when you're hitting rapidly and multiple times, maybe like in a dual wield setup, but it doesn't really work that well in my opinion. The Frostbite on this weapon is much more effective than the Wither damage. You also begin the game with the Putrid Child Catalyst, which isn't quite as good as the Catalyst you can pick up in Skyrest when you get there, but it does give you a way to cast spells from the very beginning of the game. It also comes with Diminishing Missile, Putrefaction, and Lingering Despair spells. Diminishing Missile basically is like a homing missile that does some damage to the target, also puts a debuff on them that it reduces their attack and defense so that, you know, you can deal more damage to them and they hit you for less. It's not that great in my opinion, but you will use this on hard to kill enemies. Lingering Despair is another spell that you can get very early on in Skyrest Bridge, and what this does is it puts out 4 orbs that if enemies run into, they take damage. It's kind of nice for like area denial or if there are like a lot of enemies. Frankly, it has kind of a long cast time, and a lot of times it doesn't do as much damage as you hope. So even though it's a good spell, it's not like the strongest spell ever either. And Putrefaction just puts up like a poison mist that if enemies stand in it for too long, they start getting poisoned. Not all enemies in the game can be poisoned, and it does take quite a long time for them to get poisoned. They do take significant damage from poison, which is nice, but you'll primarily probably use this on like really hard to kill enemies or bosses that can be poisoned. This class also begins the game with the Putrid Child armor set, which looks kind of cool, but like the protection of it is kind of like a lightish medium armor set. It doesn't have a ton of protection, so you might want to change that up. And then lastly, it comes with the Pendant of Parting, which is kind of nice. This makes it so that when you defeat an enemy, you have a chance of popping up one of those Wither Orbs that's kind of similar to the Lingering Despair spell. And then if an enemy runs into that, they take damage. And this just happens automatically, passively, when you kill enemies periodically. And it's kind of nice to have early on in the game. And of the other 2 classes I just mentioned in this class, of those 3 classes, this one feels like the weakest to me just because of the Wither damage on the weapon. You really need to pair this probably with another Wither damage weapon, and there aren't a lot of good ones early on in the game, so that makes that difficult to do. And then lastly, we come to the Dark Crusader class, which is kind of set up to be a Paladin class in terms of its stats. It's got Radiance, it's got Strength, it's got Heavy Armor, kind of set up that way. It does have a 2-handed weapon, so if you want a shield, you'll have to get one, and you'll probably have to increase your endurance to knock Fabric. This class is unlocked by doing the quest line of Exactor Dunmire in Skyrest Bridge. This quest line is started by picking up an item very early on in the game and then talking to him there after your initial conversation. He'll ask you to bring him some items, and you'll do that, and then the thing will just continue, and you'll follow that quest line to its completion, and you will gain this class. And of the 4 unlockable classes, this is probably the weakest. I think it's been made that way intentionally in order to, not give players who got the deluxe edition of the game in order to start with this character too much of a boost over other characters. It has a lower starting level than the other 3 classes I already mentioned. Starts with Paladin Isaac's Sword, which is another 2-handed weapon. So if you didn't like the Uda Ranger Werewolf and you still want a 2-handed weapon, this is a good class. It does start with a nice consumable and Radiant Burst Parchment, which is like a holy hand grenade, really. It just throws like a holy explosion. It's good for taking out packs of enemies. It doesn't start with a catalyst, so you'll need to pick one up in Skyrest in order to be able to cast Radiant spells, and you'll have to acquire some spells as well since it does not start with it. It does start with a Paladin's armor, though, that has very high protection. I believe it's the highest armor protection of any class in the game. It's up there with Lords. Of all the classes you can play, it's got very high armor protection. And the Paladin's Pendant, it also begins the game with increases your strength and endurance in order to give you enough strength to use the weapon that you start the game with. I'm pretty sure that's why that's there, and also some extra endurance. So it has really good endurance as well. So that's it for these classes. I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what they had, what they play like, show you some gameplay so you can look forward to. If you want to see exactly how to unlock these classes and more details about them, you can check out the official wiki. But one thing I will mention is that I know a lot of people are going to be trying to defeat the Light Reaper at the beginning of the game the first time they run into them. These classes are probably your best bet of doing that because they are stronger than the average class by about 1.5 to 2 times, depending on which class you're playing. So if you're trying to do that, that's something you want to accomplish, I suggest trying to do it with one of these classes. So that wraps up our video on the hidden unlockable classes of the game. I hope you guys found it interesting. If you have questions, leave them in the comments, and I will try and answer them as soon as I can.